Dr. John Dee, a man who died in poverty and whom history has largely forgotten. But he had a monumental impact on our modern world. His contributions to the Western expansion, science, navigation, math, and occult research have been built upon in subsequent centuries, and still resonate today. He was a driving force behind England's early exploration of North America. His work in alchemy helped to lay the foundation for what would later evolve into chemistry, and would go on to help inform more notable thinkers, such as Isaac Newton. He advocated for the mathematical approach to navigation, providing the Royal Navy with maps and equipment. He argued in the 16th century for England's adoption of the Gregorian calendar, the one we use today. He produced the first English translation of Euclid's Elements, and argued strongly for the dignity and usefulness of mathematics in its preface. And his work in Hermetic theurgy became an invaluable resource to such notable religious orders as the Rosicrucians and the Order of the Golden Dawn. John Dee was born on July 13th, 1527, to Roland Dee and Joanna Wilde in Tower Ward, London. He attended King Edward VI Grammar School, which was then named Chelmsford Chantry School, and at the age of 15, he began studying at St. John's College, Cambridge. He graduated from there in 1546 with a Bachelor's of Arts degree, and became a Fellow at Trinity College at its founding. This upbringing shows that the Dees were a noticeably wealthy family, if not actually part of the aristocracy. They certainly had enough funds to send their son to the bed to later make the introductions necessary for entry into the royal court. There is little known about John Dee's early life except for his schooling, but from this we can see that he had every opportunity to learn and take advantage of the knowledge he gained. His first major break from conventional thought seems to have come in 1554, when he was offered the position of Speaker of Mathematics at Oxford University. At that time, Oxford operated under what was called the Trivium. This was an academic philosophy which emphasized grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Dr. Dee strongly favored what was called the Quadrivium, which emphasized arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. At the time, the Trivium was on the rise in academic circles, so Dee's refusal to accept the offered position is significant. As an academic and a fellow at a prestigious college, he could have benefited from towing the line. However, even at 27, towing the line did not seem to be in his nature. In 1555, Dr. Dee faced his first major hurdle in exploring the metaphysical. After ascending to the throne, Mary Tudor, Queen Mary, invited Dr. Dee to calculate her nativity, an important aspect for any royal in order to establish their lineage and thus their authority. In the process of doing so, he contacted Princess Elizabeth. At her request, he cast a horoscope for her. Then the trouble started. A man by the name of George Ferris claimed that Dr. Dee was practicing witchcraft, a crime which could carry the death penalty at the time. Fear of witchcraft was pervasive all over England and Britain during the 1500s, and any accusation was treated seriously. Mr. Ferris claimed that through Dr. Dee's enchantments, one of his children had been struck blind, and that another had been killed. In addition, he claimed Dr. Dee was now directing his witchcraft at the Queen, which, for many, turned his horoscope and calculations of nativity into something far more sinister. Dee was subsequently arrested, thrown in prison, and his home was secured. While in prison, he was questioned by the Secretary of State, then by the Privy Council, and finally he was brought before the assembled judges in the Star Chamber. The Star Chamber was a sort of Supreme Court at the time, above the normal court of law, for use in dealing with defendants deemed too politically or commercially powerful to be held accountable in the normal courts. The Star Chamber dismissed the criminal charges, but ordered Dr. Dee to submit to a religious examination under Bishop Bonner, where he was asked to recite scripture from memory and demonstrate his piety to the examiner. It was thought at the time that if one was in league with the devil, then one would not be able to make the proclamations, recitations, or acts of devotion to the Christian God necessary for exoneration. Bonner was as convinced of Dee's piety as the judges in the Star Chamber were of his innocence, and afterward the two became good friends. It is important to keep in mind that during the years of Mary Tudor's reign, England was in the midst of a religious struggle. Mary was working hard to reverse the Reformation started by her father, Henry VIII, and continued by her younger brother, Edward VI. In her efforts to re-establish the Roman Catholic Church in England and Ireland as the dominant religious force, she sent over 280 religious dissenters to burn at the stake during her 5-year reign. So a charge of witchcraft, even against someone as well positioned as Dr. Dee, was no laughing matter. Could easily have been deadly, as it was for Dee's prison mate Bartlett Green. She wasn't called Bloody Mary for nothing. Having been exonerated by both the law and the church, Dr. Dee got back to his work. He formed a proposal containing some revolutionary ideas on how to obtain and preserve books, and he wanted to open a national library. This proposal, however, gained little traction in political circles. Unthwarted, he began what would become a lifelong quest of collecting materials and building his own library at his house in Mortlake. This would establish his Mortlake residence as a hub for academics and the intellectually curious until his departure for the continent in 1583. The next several years of his life were consumed by study and writing. His main focuses were on philosophy and mathematics. He penned several books at this time, including his translation of Euclid's Elements, and was consulted on numerous occasions by the British political elite on matters of philosophy and religion and science. But despite that, he gained more infamy than renown. His published works were not well circulated or received, and what political power he managed to attain availed him little. Instead of earning him acclaim, his reputation as an academic outsider and a general oddball earned him accusations of plagiarism, miserly hoarding his knowledge, and attempts to discredit him. In one of his last mainstream philosophical works, he went so far as to refer to himself as, quote, an unknown friend, unquote, in order to avoid the expected backlash. Eventually, he gave up trying to be the English Aristotle and turned his attention to other matters. When Queen Mary died in 1558, her younger half-sister, Elizabeth I, took the throne. She appointed her old tutor and friend, Dr. Dee, as her scientific advisor. He gratefully accepted the position, promising her his loyalty and petitioning her, not for money or land, but for protection. This would come into play throughout the rest of Queen Elizabeth's reign, as Dr. Dee was never again charged or prosecuted for witchcraft or other magical crimes. In this capacity, he did his best to advocate for the naval expansion of England and of the British Empire, a term Dr. Dee did not create, but is credited with popularizing and injecting into the minds of the British royals. He was also key in promoting the British exploration and expansion to North America, an endeavor that would change the face of the Western world. Queen Elizabeth, unlike Mary Tudor, was in favor of the Reformation and did much to reverse the work of her predecessor, but she was not a fan of magic or witchcraft. So it is curious how, as Dr. Dee continued with what he called his experiments, he seemed immune from accusations or prosecutions. Whether it was his perceived piety, his position as the Queen's advisor, or his association with Bishop Bonner, he was never arrested or tried again on crimes in that vein. Dr. Dee was married 3 times and had 8 children over his life. His position in court never reached any significant heights, despite his close association with the Queen. He could not secure patronage despite having made many contributions in the fields of mathematics and navigation, and despite his knowledge and research into alchemy, which could have brought him money and status. He declined to focus on that field and so never really benefited from it. All these factors contributed to a life of low station and helped convince him to leave England for the continent in 1583. After a less than profitable trip to Poland, he, along with his associate Edward Kelly, traveled around Central Europe for 6 years. He returned home to Mortlake in 1589 to find that the place had been looted and many of his most prized books and artifacts had been stolen. He sought out the help of Queen Elizabeth again, but she could do little. The animosity towards the occult, science, and proto-science in general had increased during his time away, and Elizabeth, though sympathetic to Dr. Dee's situation, was more interested in the possibility that he could convince his associate, Edward Kelly, who was working as the alchemist to Emperor Rudolph II at the time, to return to England and help with the royal financial issues. She did appoint Dee Warden of Christ College, Manchester, however, and he held this position until his death at age 81, in late 1608 or early 1609, the records aren't entirely clear. The public life of John Dee was in no way illustrious. He was not a power player in the English court. He held little sway in academia. In fact, most of his colleagues dismissed, discredited, or despised him. He was never very famous or very rich, as evidenced by dying as he did in his home at Mortlake and selling his possessions to pay for basic necessities towards the end. From this, many have consigned Dr. Dee to a footnote in history, a general failure by most modern standards, with a few flashes of genius in the historical record. That is, if one does not consider his other efforts, the ones he focused on instead of conventional fame and fortune. Dr. Dee had an interest in subjects outside of the conventional curriculum for all of his life. Spirits, angels, and paranormal forces were as real to him as alchemy and the mathematics he tirelessly promoted. To him, these were all tools that a person with knowledge and skill could use to understand the universe. It's important to understand this in order to give context and provide motivation to his experiments. In contrast to the purely materialistic mentality pervasive in the modern world, religion was the dominant force in the 1500s. Most people believed in a god, though there were frequent and often bloody disputes as to whom that god was and what he actually wanted. Materialism existed and was believed in by many at the time, but it was overshadowed by the doctrines and goals of the Church. This provided the framework under which intellectual exploration proceeded in the 1500s. Few projects get funded today unless they can demonstrate a profitable result, a way to make money for their benefactors. In England, during that time, few researchers could gain patronage unless they could demonstrate a benefit to either the royalty or the Church. This framework is largely the reason why alchemy was an accepted practice, and many other unorthodox fields of study were not. Alchemy was largely seen as a money-making venture, as in the traditional idea of changing baser metals into gold. And, as it did not involve spirits, it did not directly conflict with church doctrine. Dr. Dee's focus was not on alchemy, although that probably would have provided a much more comfortable life for him and his family. His focus was on religion and trying to understand the mysteries through Hermetic practices, Neoplatonic philosophy, and mathematics. Hermeticism and Neoplatonic philosophy share many commonalities in reference to Dr. Dee's work. The main concept joining the two in this context is the idea of the One, a single point of divinity that is pure truth and the origin of all things. Dee's experiments, and indeed the motive for his research, was in a quest to find this one point of truth, which he understood as the one true God or religion that would unify the fighting religious factions in Britain at the time, and bring humanity to a higher level of prosperity and understanding. I am not going to go into the rich and textured philosophies of Hermeticism and Neoplatonism now, but if you would like to see these or any other subjects related to folklore and cultural practices covered on this channel, please leave a comment below. Suffice it to say that these modes of thinking and the search for the One, or what Hermetic traditions refer to as Prisca Theologia, was the motivation for Dee's experiments in theurgy. Theurgy, in short, is the attempt to contact and interact with good or divine beings, as opposed to its counter-practice, Goetia, which is the attempt to contact and interact with bad or demonic beings. In the framework of Dee's Christian beliefs, this theurgy took the form of attempts to contact angels, which he understood as the messengers of his God and the means by which divine information could reach human ears. As for mathematics, this has a strong tradition in the dominant religions both then and today. Most of the modern world understands mathematics in reference to science. But it was the Hindu and Islamic traditions that developed the foundational rules and functions we know today. From them, it spread to the Western world. Systems like the Jewish Kabbalah and Dee's own calculations were extensions of these mathematical systems. Dee believed that mathematics were the key to understanding the natural world. And as he saw the natural world as a creation of God, he saw math as a path to understanding the workings of that God. In essence, he thought that if he could understand how God worked, then he could learn a lot about who God was and what he actually wanted. This would bring him closer to the Prisca Theologia he was after. Dr. Dee used scrying as his method for his experiments in theurgy. By the use of mirrors, a special table inscribed with runes, and a crystal ball, he attempted to contact angels whom he hoped would impart knowledge and wisdom that he couldn't gain from conventional sources. The first solid report of this came on May 25, 1581, when, in his journal, he wrote, "I had sight in cristallo offered me, and I saw." This handwritten note would mark the turning point in John Dee's life. Disillusioned by the lack of success in academia and politics, he would spend the rest of his days focusing on his theurgic experiments. Although he seemed to either have trouble with or low confidence in his own scrying abilities, as he employed a series of mediums to do the scrying for him while he recorded the results. The first medium that Dr. Dee employed was a man named Barnabas Saul, who professed himself to be a preacher and an occultist. He claimed to have seen a treasure of old books in Northamptonshire, but that turned out to be bunk. He was later charged with a crime, though the records don't say what he was charged with. He was acquitted, but claimed that he could no longer see or interact with spirits, so that ended his relationship with John Dee. No sooner had Barnabas Saul departed from Mortlake than Edward Kelly arrived. Edward Kelly, who at the time was calling himself Edward Talbot to avoid a counterfeiting charge, is quite possibly the most controversial and contentious aspect of Dee's experiments. Friend or foe, assistant or antagonist, Edward Kelly certainly complicated things. Many have used Kelly as a way to discredit Dee. They have said that Kelly, a con man and grave robber, tricked Dr. Dee, who they see as a credulous old fool, into believing whatever he said. Others claim that Kelly simply made up the scrying sessions and tailored them to what he thought Dr. Dee would want to hear. These accusations do not bear scrutiny, though. Many of the scrying attempts with Kelly were successful in the sense that communication was established and a dialogue occurred. But the information given by the angel in question was often off-topic, inconsequential, or practically useless. If Kelly was trying to tell Dee what he thought the old man wanted to hear, then he was doing a very bad job of it. There are numerous records made by Dr. Dee that contradict the idea that he was simply taken in by a con man. He took detailed and meticulous notes of their sessions and reportedly accepted physical objects from the angels. He questioned and inquired of the spirits, asking things like how they were able to speak without a physical form, and are the books in his collection of any excellency. These examples and many others show that he was not simply swallowing whatever Kelly offered. Also, Dr. Dee took care to write many of his alchemical notes in Greek and Latin, languages that the partially educated Kelly could not understand. This was likely because Kelly made no mystery about his desire to gain Dee's alchemical knowledge. In fact, it was the reason Edward Kelly sought out Dr. Dee in the first place. Regardless of his piety and his belief in the efficacy of his experiments, it is clear that Dr. Dee treated Edward Kelly with a healthy dose of skepticism. Dee and Kelly worked off and on with each other for 7 years, between 1582 and 1589. They would part for times, usually after an argument or when Dee had just had enough of Kelly, and then they would join again when Dr. Dee could not find a suitable replacement medium. Over this time, Dr. Dee amassed one of the largest and most detailed collections of theurgic experiments ever to be written. Dee drew from far older philosophies, religious texts, occult texts, and science to describe and record his search for wisdom. Even after he returned to Mortlake from his time abroad and his library was in shambles, he continued his research and experiments. He never again attained the results he had with Kelly, and he would never again attain the small amount of fame he had in his youth, but he never stopped his quest for knowledge. Whether you agree or not with his religion, his experiments, his contribution to British imperialism, or even that a quest of knowledge outside of the commonly prescribed methods is a worthwhile pursuit, Dr. Dee deserves to be remembered.